on the motion, this house opposes the body as a temple narrative. Prime Minister, you're good to go. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Cool. Three claims from opening government. Firstly, why this means you're significantly more restrictive towards other people and what they can do with their own body. Secondarily, why this means people feel significantly more guilt and it's harder for them to access the benefits of religion or God. And thirdly, why people just partaking in simple bodily pleasures is just a good thing that we should be supporting. Firstly, on framing. One, we think this narrative is most prominent and important within religion. All might say this ends up trickling down and influencing how people value or treat their own body. A few things on that. Firstly, it isn't an exclusive narrative to caring about your own body. Society always have had incentives to say, hey, maybe we should be eating healthily, maybe we should be going on exercise. There are different narratives that people often use. I'm not sure why this is the most important one, why this is most exclusive. And secondarily, when people outside of religion use it, it's often done semi-seriously or semi-jokingly, like your body is a temple, bro. Like maybe it might use this specific aesthetic, but clearly doesn't buy into the actual fact that your body is a literal temple, which I think often religions do end up enforcing. Secondarily, what does this narrative look like? And I think it looks like the info slide, but let's explain what this means for religious people. I think it looks like the body itself is a property of God that is holy as God is. Notably, it is not yours, but a vessel that is God has worked through you, and you're allowing to, your soul has been able to access the physical world through the gift that God has ended up giving you. This means it often retains the holiness and the sanctimony think it is one that is just more likely to just claim that your body is your own. It is as sinned as the ground is and as this reality is. It is not sacred inherently, and while being a vessel to work through and to get sins or joys to come from, it is just a logical extension of your soul, but still is grounded and therefore is still as prone to failure or mistakes as regular human beings are. First claim, why does it mean you're significantly more restrictive towards other people's bodily autonomy? And the claim here is that when you perceive all bodies to be works of God, you perceive any action that individuals take over their own body to be actively defiling and working against the actions of God. And note the framing. This isn't just a normal sin. This is sometimes some of the highest order crimes that individuals can end up opting into. What this means then is that I think you have an individual onus to restrict what people are able to do within their own body. This looks like religious organizations advocating more towards things like abortion or making sure those things don't end up occurring. Mothers restricting their daughters from sleeping with people because you're vilifying them. But it also looks like restricting other people from interacting with this stuff. So think of like Hinduism and having things like the untouchables. These individuals are just inherently lower or worthy because they're more dirty. They don't clean their body as they're used to. Therefore, they're just less holy, and therefore it's an act of sin to be interacting with them. And let's be clear here. Maybe these things might still be considered sin on the comparative. The difference is though, is whether you're just damaging yourself and you're just and you know it's the broken mortal man, or you're hurting an active proponent of God's work, which I would often note on a feminist angle often involves more restriction of female autonomy than it often does guys. It often leads to things like women not being able to show their own body, represent them within their own way, or mothers actively restricting their daughters. Notably, I think there is a significant margin on that claim, and means that even if you think people are committing a harm, you do not believe something that is being actively damaged or gifted and a privilege that they end up having. But I think this also means that if you are ending up taking part in these bodily harms, because Op might say you might intervene more in good ways, you don't want people to criticize you when you have partaken in these things or have harmed your body in these ways. You're worried about the way in which this harms people's perception of you. On the comparative, I think you're just far more likely to talk about it or be more casual about it, because even if it is a sin, the extent to which you're going to be judged or punished for it, it's significantly lower than it would be on our side of the house, meaning the ability for these individuals to end up getting help, because it's more a direct action of the actions you have taken, which can be forgiven. But once you've actively disposed the temple of God, people are far more likely to be more restrictive or harmful. And this isn't a small thing. This is actively people like harming their specific children, actively taking part in things like just physical violence. But even if not physical violence, it is mental violence and mental shaming. And I think if we're able to avoid those things, even to a marginal degree, I think that is significantly huge to a large amounts of individuals. The second claim is that we significantly reduce the extent to which individuals feel shamed about taking part in due diligence, and so they're more able to access the benefit of it. Notably, it is the most addicted who are often more difficult to access religion again. Those who have partaken in perhaps bad decisions within their younger life, either through circumstantial decisions because they've grown up in poorer communities where tattoos and things were significantly more socially example, or they're just more genetically predisposed to getting addicted to certain things. We often note like addiction just do have just far more genetic predispositions towards it. This means that when individuals access things like local religious centers or people within their society have taken part in these things, they're honestly just more likely to end up being one, taught to feel immense amount of shame for all their past actions. In order to engage with the specific religion, you have to believe that everything you have committed towards your own body has been an act of sin and harm against God. Notably, for those who often do end up believing in these things, they often carry this shame for the rest of their life because these are things that cannot be underdone. The birthmarks that you've gotten from when you had like a child out of wedlock is not something that can ever be gotten rid of. The tattoos that you have gotten since when you were 15, or perhaps like the heroin sticks and like the heroin scars on the arm, these things aren't able to be gotten rid of. So I think you just feel immense amounts of shame, immense amounts of guilt that I think weigh over you. But secondarily, the community judges you intensely, and even if they don't do it openly, they do things like not talking to you, not letting your children hang out with you, not making you feel comfortable in an own home. This means there's a substantially high barrier of those individuals to enter, and often means they fall back into things like their vices once more. Meaning for the most vulnerable groups and most vulnerable communities, they just aren't able to access the benefits of religion, of having someone you're able to talk to, of having someone who isn't able to judge you, because when you show up with a tattoo on your arm, the people judge you intensely as a result of that. This also just creates internal cultures because you're never able to interact with these different other people. So it means subsequent internal groups often end up forming. Sure, Anders.
Yeah. Yeah, so the issue is that obviously there are other reasons why things like abortion are wrong. Killing somebody's soul is still going to be a bad thing either way. It's unclear that this is the particular margin.
Maybe like abortion might be a difficult claim, but I think in terms of everything else that we've argued, in terms of tattoos, drinking, having children, etc., we're still able to claim that these things, there's still a margin on the sorts of sin that ends up occurring, and I think it leans towards our sort of side. The final claim is just on the joys of bodily pleasures, the crisp taste of a nice cider, a good blowjob, eating a burger after a hard-earned day at the airport. Honestly, these narratives, I think, just stop people from accessing these things. Why do most people engage in these things in good ways and honestly not addictive? Firstly, there are societal incentives to make sure there are just large amounts of information and people don't end up utilizing it. Secondarily, people are often aware these things are addictive, often moderating in their usage. And this might seem like a silly claim in the round, but I think these things do matter. Firstly, they bring large amounts of joy towards people's life. It's hard to calculate these sorts of things, but they just make a hard day easier, and they just make a good day even nicer. Secondarily, they allow people to access preferences towards things they end up liking better. Sometimes you might end up engaging with these things in a specific way, but when religions internally have a culture where these things are often more accepted, it becomes easier to internally regulate towards religious communities themselves. But it also just means there's just far more proliferation of these information. You're able to give these information towards your kids on the ground or other people end up interacting with. So just things like safe sex become better practices, and you don't have the harms that end up occurring on opposition side. Oh,
So much. Hello.
All right, give me 1 second. Also, I'll take POIs in chat. I want to begin by responding to the OG arguments about the feelings of shame and guilt and the feeling of judgment from people who have been perceived to be desecrating their own bodies. First, we're going to make an argument about why this reduces instances of acting self-destructively and self-harm, and this is going to be a more important impact in this round. And this is because on weighing, the prevention of harm is more important than possible feelings of judgment afterwards. This is because, firstly, religions often offer things like the ability to repent and confess. And this is structurally likely because religions want to buy in. They often find the most outrage in people who are, at the lowest points in their life, who are the most likely to turn to God. And given this is often the target demographic they're trying to cater to, obviously they don't want these people to feel ashamed, and they want them to buy in. So this means that people often offer ways of re-accessing God or re-accessing salvation. So things like going to confessions to be able to do things like repent through many ways to cleanse yourself of sin. So this offers a way out even if you have already done harm for yourself. Comparatively, it's more important to prevent harm being done to you in the first place because this is a larger margin of change, because this instances of harm often have trickle down with long-term impacts on these people in the future. Or things like addiction, if they so happen, often are causes of spirals that can ruin your life when it's harder and harder to get out of it the further deeper in you go. Or even things like perhaps like chastity, as they allude to, or things like sex. The ability for people to be self-destructive towards themselves if they don't respect their own body can permanently ruin their own psychological experience of their own body in the future. Where every single time you want to sleep with someone, you think about the previous times in which your body was used as an instrument for someone else's pleasure. You feel like you're reduced to your flesh in a way that is incredibly demeaning, and this trauma often lasts with you into the future. Prevention of harm is more important. Secondly, shame is very unlikely. Why? This is because the way the narrative is portrayed to you is often centered around love, where God gave you this body because he cares about you, because he is generous, because he is loving. And this is structurally likely because in order to make your body seem beautiful, you want it to be seen as a product of good intentions. But because it centers around the forgiving and loving nature of God, it's unlikely that you often feel an internalized shame as a consequence of this. And also because this is proliferated within communities to be like we should respect and try and forgive these people because they still maintain an object of God's love, so we should not treat them poorly. Two arguments. Firstly, you treat yourself better. How does this manifest? Firstly, I think this applies in general self-care, both partially towards people who are but also, I do think this applies to people who are secular, who maybe not don't believe in like the aesthetic of, ooh, like your body's a temple, but they believe in like concepts like the soul on a philosophical level, which still applies in this debate. And this is very important because it's often very necessary. People often become disillusioned with themselves and their own lives. You fall into spirals when you fail in life, and you feel like you are worthless. You feel like you cannot escape the feeling of being trapped in your own head and the awful way you look at yourself. They say there's often other narratives to combat this. This is just an asserted. Other narratives are insufficient, and this is because other narratives often are centered around them being good for yourself. You should do things like work out because it's good for yourself to be healthy. But the problem is for the people at the darkest moments in their life, they do not care about themselves. They cannot access things like self-love. Why does this change? First, even if you cannot respect yourself, you often respect the people that care about you, that love you. So this is, for example, God you often associate with being a higher being that you worship, or the concept of a soul that feels kind of detached from your immediate physical experience. You were born with at any given immediate feeling of disillusionment as well. But often preemptively internalizing narratives of beauty can help prevent people from falling down into these spirals in the first place. So if they want to make an argument that says people who are doing really poorly can't internalize this, I think people internalizing this beforehand also can prevent these spirals in the first place. Second mechanism, I think this just also reinforces norms of self-love, where often these people can derive self-worth from feeling like they're cared about, and for their body to feel like it is holy and a product of love and a product of something spiritual or beautiful can often help them find value in themselves when they cannot find value in anything else that they're doing, whether it be their work, their job, their love life, or anything else. Secondly, I think this is an important source of religious meaning for a large amount of people, where oftentimes people just like feel like they're imbued with the gift of God. They feel like the thing they're walking around with, like their body, their physique, the experiences they have are all stemming from a sacred vessel that he gifted towards you. And this feeling of sacredness often creates also simultaneously a perception or a feeling that you remain connected with God. And this is because sacredness is a persisting quality. Your body continues to be sacred. And the sacredness has a connotation of being religiously important or religiously or spiritually critical, which makes you feel like you remain or retain some degree of connection with God. And this is very important because this is an entity of deep respect, an entity that defines people's lives and how they connects to senses of meaning and beauty. And this feeling of closeness itself, maybe it seems trivial in a debate round, but this is a constant feeling that adds up over time and is a source of genuine meaning for people that is important to consider. Thirdly, I think this is an important cause to countervailing influence against body image issues. Before that, sure.
There's very little incentive for the groups or people who spread this narrative to make it so that your impure body is easily redeemable, because then it's much harder to extract concessions from anyone in service of this objective.
But you have to balance this with people that are already incredibly emotionally exhausted and burnt out. So you have incentives to want to keep them coming to, for example, church instead of rotting away at home because they're already doing so poorly in a place where marginal amounts of resistance make it very easy for them to check out. Thirdly, on body image issues, I think on the counterfactual, people still care about your body. They focus on your physicality, the way you look, the value you give to people on an aesthetic level. And this is structurally reinforced through things like, beauty, the makeup industry, social media, etc. These like generic reasons. Like people will care about the way you look look and your physical body on the counterfactual. This is a countervailing norm because this says your body is not invaluable because of the way it looks on the outside, the physical, like physical appearance of it, but rather it's because it houses something deeper and more meaningful on the inside, your soul, the gift from God, the blessings or the sacredness that cannot be reflected on the outside. This gives people a way of accessing meaning, whereas otherwise they may feel like they are judged for who they are on the outside, which is often very problematic for people that do not conform to conventional beauty standards. Finally, I think this is a useful tool for religious activists because the problem with the counterfactual is religious narratives will still exist to reinforce things like, for example, like chastity or judgment towards people who want to get abortions or have sex. This is just because of like other narratives, like for example, there's the female body seen as like an object to be owned by men. It's stigmatized if you have sex with many people because it makes you seem used by multiple men. Like there's other kinds of narratives, but critically, it's what you do afterwards. So for example, you have significantly less female genital mutilation if it's seen as being a desecration of your body and a gift from God afterwards. And the reason it's often a useful tool for activists is because it's often seen as a more decentralized way of accessing meaning, where each individual has the most access to their own internal life and the experience of their own soul, as opposed to people from the outside. And this more decentralized way of accessing or interpreting the narrative gives activists the method of saying, if it is the case that we judge these people, we should not punish them in incredibly harmful ways afterwards through things like mutilation, because the body is still worthy of respect as a gift from God.
Thanks so much, DPM.
Cool. So, as I was thinking through this, I kind of felt like opening opposition was making some kind of distinction that didn't really exist. And it took me a second to come up with the answer. But the problem is, people who believe these things believe that God created everything, right? Like that's the belief. The belief is that God created everything on the planet, the grass, the trees, the sky, the ground, you. That's the idea, right? Like God's somewhat imbued in all of these aspects, including in things like Buddhism and Hinduism, because it's like the breath of the person, right? The difference between that kind of creation and the kind of creation of the body is the reason that opening opposition doesn't make sense to me, which is that all of their arguments are just based on the fact that you are created by God and therefore you are valuable because you are created by God. But the problem is there's a difference between that and the body as a temple narrative, because there's a difference between the grass and a human being. There's a like qualitative difference between these things under these narratives. The difference is a temple can be corrupted. And when it's corrupted, it can't be redeemed because it's a sacred place. And that means that it's so holy that once it's been touched by evil, it's irredeemable fundamentally. Or perhaps, I guess some people say like you can do a one-time redemption, but you definitely can't do it more than once because it's uniquely sacred. It's uniquely close to God, which means that it requires a higher level of holiness than your average everyday grass, tree, ground, etc. But despite the fact that those things are also created by God, I think the comparative narrative is that your body would be like these other things, that your body is created by God, therefore it's valuable the way that it is, therefore it's valuable in all of these ways, but it's not that it's uncorruptible, right? Because that's what the difference is between the body as a temple narrative, that you are a sacred vessel specifically. I think they do have to stand behind a lack of redemption as part of this aspect, because I think they do have to stand behind these narratives making a distinction between you as a person and the tree that God also created. And I think the way that that distinction is made is via this narrative specifically and via the idea of a sacred vessel and the idea of corruption. Basically, I think that sacred things can be corrupted, but they can't necessarily be redeemed in the same way that non-sacred things can be. So then on prevention versus after the fact, because their claim is that whenever you believe that your body is sacred, because this is a higher level, you probably do fewer things that are bad to yourself. I think that this is true. Probably you do fewer things that are bad to yourself, except for one problem, which is that as soon as you have one kind of slip or one kind of fall, or perhaps two kinds of slips and two kinds of falls, depending on which theology you're following, now it doesn't matter. You can do as many of the bad things as you want because now you've perverted or corrupted the temple. The temple is no longer a vessel of God because you've pushed God out directly via your evil actions, which means that there is no way for you to redeem yourself and there is no way to get back. This also happens via things like thought, because part of the narrative is that your thoughts themselves ought to be respectful towards this vessel in order to avoid its corruption. So let's talk about how you engage with unhealthy thought patterns on each side of the house. On our side of the house, whenever you have an unhealthy thought pattern, the idea is that it's a problem to be solved, right? Like, you probably don't want to stamp on the grass just because you feel like it. You don't want to harm your body for no particular reason because God made it and you ought to be somewhat respectful of all of God's creations. But on their side of the house, the thought itself is a sin, and you have created perversion by thinking that thing, even for a moment. And this is a thing that has done harm to the vessel, and you can't take back that harm that you've done. That's when the guilt and shame kicks in. And that's whenever I think that you don't actually substantially prevent people from engaging in self-destructive behavior because they don't believe that they can fix that self-destructive behavior. I think that that's the delta. The question is whether it's more important to prevent a few people from engaging in it, or it's more important to prevent most people will engage with this once. I just think it's realistic that it's very difficult to avoid thought patterns, that it's nearly impossible, in fact, to stop yourself from thinking about a thing once you've begun to think about it. And so the question is whether it's more important to help those people get themselves back on track. And that's the difference in this debate. I'll take the POI from closing.
Yeah, so when Notre Dame built down, did the French just leave it? Clearly, you can rebuild and maintain temples.
You can rebuild and maintain temples, but Notre Dame was not corrupted, right? You didn't have people like having an orgy inside of Notre Dame, right? Like I think that would be a vastly different scenario. And I do think that whenever temples are corrupted, generally people do tear them down and they don't rebuild them. The whole idea of the Judeo-Christian theology, right? The basis of it is that you have the Ark of the Covenant that no one can touch, because if you touch it, you've corrupted it, and the consequence is that you must die because it's impossible to touch that and live because it's too holy, and you will have caused a thing that is irreversible and therefore a thing that must be treated with as severely as possible. So but even if you don't buy that conception of all of those things, even if you just want to engage on the idea that they're going to be able to prevent some things, we're not going to be able to prevent those things. I have a few things on that. I think that there is a difference on when others can and should intervene in between these two things, and the difference between something that's sacred and something that's just created by God. I think that there's normalized external engagement whenever it's sacred. This is why you get a difference on things like abortion, or on things like actively preventing other people from getting tattoos. Because the idea is that a sacred thing is something that everyone ought to preserve. But you try and prevent your friends from sinning, but you don't actively make it impossible for them to sin, because there's an idea that you ought not restrict their agency, and their agency matters at least to some degree. The only time you have the capacity to intervene and directly make it impossible for them to engage in sin is whenever you have this like higher order desire or higher order thing you need to tackle, the idea of sacredness that you need to preserve, which I think means that at the bare minimum, you definitely get substantially more external engagement into other people's lives. These are people believing that it's okay for them to comment on what other people are doing with their bodies in the lowest level, but this is also in the highest level, like actual laws put in place in order to control what people are doing with their bodies, in order to minimize the sins that are taking place in these sacred areas, because the idea is that a sacred thing is something that everyone must intervene in. I don't think that this can be traded off against maybe preventing a handful of people from hurting themselves, because I think the thought processes that you spiral into whenever you believe that you ought to harm yourself are so corrupting and so addictive that you are not thinking rationally in those moments. I think that whenever you are in a severe depressive episode, you're not thinking about people around you oftentimes, which is why people in severe depressive episodes often end up committing suicide, because they aren't thinking about the consequences to people around them. They're only thinking about how they feel in that moment and responding directly to that thing. I don't think you can prove to me in a way that I will believe that people genuinely consider their the religion that they are engaging in, whenever they don't have the ability to even be rational about the people who are more proximate to them, that they see the consequences of them hurting themselves on day by day.
Thanks, TLO.
POIs in chat, please. Also, thanks to Liz for doing this tournament with me. It has been a true blast. Lots of fun, lots of fun. This debate is going to become very complicated very fast because it's basically a characterization debate. Gov says the way most people understand the body as a temple narrative is that you should shame those who are sinning against God's temple. You should impose very high standards on what it means to purify the temple of your soul. And you should therefore defame others who are not treating their body like the temple that it is. And the op characterization is that this is mostly a narrative that promotes self-love. It encourages people to look after their body in ways that make sense to them and feel right to them. It tells people in difficult moments that they have innate spiritual value embedded in them, and that you should therefore be willing to do what feels right. And the team that wins the debate is effectively the team that best characterizes which version of the narrative predominates and which conception is most likely to be embedded in the minds of believers. 4 deadlock breakers that OO wins to win this clash. First, Gov mischaracterizes the incentives of the religious and cultural elites pushing this narrative. The vast majority of religious leaders, even those in moderately conservative areas, note that ultra-regressive areas are probably largely symmetric on both sides of the debate because ultra-regressive communities have explicit coercive capacity to, for example, force women to not have abortions or force gay people to not have sex. And therefore, this is mostly a comparative a version of this narrative you shaming others. But in the vast majority of cases, most people understand this narrative as applying much more to their own self-perception than how they understand others. Why is that? First, because the impact on external treatment is probably limited or somewhat marginal in the sense that on both sides, you think drinking or smoking or getting tattoos or having sex is a sin, and you plausibly think it's even worse of a sin on their side of the house because the person that is committing the sin does not have innate spiritual worth because their body is literally not a temple. But the much greater margin of change is on the internal perspective, how you feel about yourself. And notably, the vast majority of people find this narrative empowering. And the reason they find it empowering is because life fucking sucks for lots of people. And what gives you tremendous value is the sense that even though life is difficult, God is literally inside me. And for a religious person who believes that God is the greatest gift to the world, that knowledge of self-beauty, even if they feel bad about themselves, is what gives them hope to continue fighting. The second deadlock breaker is that this narrative is much more egalitarian than comparatives. What is the likely alternative to a narrative that the body is a temple? It is that God is embedded in some, but not all. That God exists in some souls, but not all souls. Why is that? All of opening government's reasons. The fact that religions are often socially conservative and often socially regressive. And what that means is that the comparative is what often happened historically, which is to say, religion saying that some people have a physical and spiritual closer connection to God than others. The narrative that the body is a temple is egalitarian and universal. It says that all bodies are created by God and embedded with God's meaning. Why is this important? 2 implications. First, it means shaming gets worse on their side of the house. Why? Because you are more likely to shame someone when you feel as a privileged member of a religious community like God has been invested in your soul, but not the soul of the woman who's having the abortion. It gives you a greater sense of spiritual superiority and supremacy to make those claims. And maybe, yes, this happens somewhat on both sides. But opening government has conceded this narrative is very powerful, which is why the impact is asymmetric. Before I also explain why you are more likely to get harsh policing as opposed to rehabilitation, I'll take CGPOI.
How do you think individuals tell when the temple is sufficiently clean? And isn't there a very large incentive to convince people that it's very close to clean, but not quite?
No, the point is that the 2 things. First, the way that people self-internalize this narrative is typically optimistic. People typically evolve to have an optimism bias. People like to feel like they are good in life or that they are progressing towards a better goal. And even if religious leaders tell you that you need to make more changes to your life, it's often the case that people feel like those goals are achievable, that they don't need to fundamentally change their entire life because religious leaders know that narrative would likely not be palatable. People would be unlikely to buy into it or would simply check out as a consequence of apathy or a feeling of failure. But also, I want to note that on their side of the house, you will be much more aggressive in your policing of people's behavior. Look, regressives will think that abortion, having tattoos, etc., is a sin on both sides. Here's the key delta. On our side of the house, you think that the person that committed the sin is a temple which ought be rebuilt. And that means that you are more likely to have a discussion with that person. You are more likely to talk with that person to get a sense of their perspective. What happens on their side? The act of having an abortion or getting a tattoo is still seen as a sin, and it affects the sinfulness of the community. It affects your collective relationship with God. So you still police it. The difference is that you just want to punish the person because you don't think of the person as having the ability or need to improve. On our side of the house, you look at a person who sins and say, they are a temple and I want them to be better. On their side, you look at a person and just see the sinner. There is optimism on our side and none on theirs. Happy to oppose.
Thanks so much. MG.
Can everyone see and hear me okay?
Yep, we can.
Great. One second. You can offer POI however you like. It doesn't matter if Ryan is correct that this narrative means that you think all bodies were created by God, because what you perceive bodies are as a reflection of something more important, which is the souls that they hold. So the status of that body is an exposition of the spiritual core of that person. So when it falls into disrepair, it isn't just that they're lazy, or maybe more compassionately, they just had too much work to do and couldn't go to the gym, but rather a moral deficiency at the center of their character. From CG, we want to broaden this debate. We want to speak about the ways in which this narrative applied that aren't just restricted to strictly religious communities. We want to look at its commercialization and spread, and the way that it encourages people into dangerous behavior with regards often to fitness and well-being. Why is this not only restricted to strict religious groups? We're going to move a little bit away from our OG here and take up on their best grounds where it's true that religious communities still exert high degrees of control and look therefore at where this narrative has delta elsewhere. First, religious narratives linger very powerfully. So even when there's secularization, as we've seen across much of Europe, often things like morality retain. So Christian morality still informs a huge amount of law that exists across Europe. So even when the words get removed, the sentiments still remain in people's minds, they're passed down generations. Second, religious ideas often spread outwards. Obviously, for many religions, a key component is spreading it to other people. Often this means ideas and concepts catch on. They are deliberately pushed outwards. And whilst they might get modified and changed as they move, they're pushed to spread across society. Third, things just get trendified. As a young white girly myself, I can say we love a bit of yoga and matcha, and often that means stealing, especially from the spiritual things that seem different and interesting, that often looks like adopting concepts from religion. And it doesn't mean transporting all of the words, but it does mean transporting the core sentiments that exist. So taking the body as a temple narrative and holding on to its core tenets of what it tells you to do, that it reflects something about your morality and that your body ought to be compared, it ought to be protected at all costs, even if you don't bring the ideas of God across. What does this mean? First, I would notice that it broadens the scope of what a lot of our impacts are going to apply to, just in how many people we're going to be able to access. Because when we explain in a moment how this has been so heavily commercialized and why many people have internalized this narrative, who even when they aren't hearing it from priests, we're able to access more people. But second, as I flag at the top, we take a bit of a more realistic characterization of our opening, because it is just true that this has little delta on religious communities where things like abortion are likely to be legalized anyway. But when we tell you this narrative is one that most intensifies things like body shaming and encouraging people into awful diets and fitness, we think it's very, very damaging. What does the commercialization of this narrative look like, and how has it been used as a method of control? First, it looks like things like fitness movements and training, which use body as a temple, as a foundation, i.e. this is the central philosophy that it tells to all their followers when they sign on in the first place. This is the motivation, this is what gets sent out to you, reminded to you in those emails, etc. Second, products which allow you to access this, the types of things like that link into spirituality but are also wellness, things like Pilates, yoga, cleansing your chakras, things that blur the line between what is fitness and what is spirituality and your soul. Why is viewing wellness through this particular paradigm of body as a temple so pernicious? First, your body is a constant project. Here I would agree with opposition that it's true that it's unlikely that you are ever irredeemable. As Max says in his POI, people like religious leaders have an incentive to say you could potentially try and redeem yourself, right? They want you to do it. But crucially, it's got to be difficult. It can't be so easy that you'd happily defile the temple anytime because it would be so easy to get back from that, but rather something difficult that you have to strive for. So we think then the frame of this is that your body is a constant project, one that you have to continually modify. The reasons for this are A, there is never an end point. You are never sufficiently holy, sufficiently cleansed, and temple can never be too grand, such as it can always improve. But B, because even omission is an act of defiling the temple. So letting your body fall into disrepair through not acting is also one that's damaging in those cases. We think the comparative of this is when people consider like their body and wellness is a few things. First, a bit of an understanding that it might fluctuate over time or that things are more contextual to you. And when it isn't something that reflects your moral worth, that's something easier to tolerate. But second, you're able to do things like have a measurable goal, like a time you want to hit in a run, and allow that to be sufficient to reward yourself and take a break because you don't need to strive to something continually unattainable. No, thank you. Secondly, the way your incentive to continue doing things like fitness or well-being changes. What do they change to? A, it's perceived as a duty. You have an obligation to do this. So within religious communities, that might be explicitly you have an obligation to God to protect his creation. Or in a more secular form, an abstract duty that it's something you ought to do to be a morally upstanding member of the community. B, it's an expression of your worth, so it's how you can be measured. You can be measured on how fit you are. You can be measured, your spiritual worth can be measured on whether you're attaining certain goals. Your moral character is often shown by how much you're able to control this. We think under a comparative, other narratives dominate why you might want to do fitness and well-being. It might be to feel good, it might be to hold strength through your old age, or it might be to achieve a certain goal. But unfortunately, these incentives, things that drive you forward, often get crowded out by narratives of body as a temple, which are about control and duty because they are harsher, they push through stronger. They might be initially good for you because they're such a powerful motivator, but in the long run are much more destructive. For the third and final aspect of this, I'll take opening.
So your site still has market incentive to sell extractive self-improvement programs. The difference is your justification is more pernicious. For example, to look attractive, which is conditional, versus the inherent value of your
Let's talk
body.
about this because let's notice that a huge amount of these things are just much easier to tear down. That is to say, if my marketing is saying this is explicitly to make you look good, then that's something that a huge amount of like the feminist movement can tackle, explicitly explain to people why that's something you ought not tangle your self-worth up in. But narratives like body as a temple are just much harder to deconstruct. It's very hard to convince someone that they shouldn't tie up their moral worth if they feel it as abstract things like a duty. So it's not about whether this exists at all. We are absolutely willing to say, of course, beauty standards still exist. This is a marginal debate, but it's about how much you're able to control and push people forward. So it's about whether beauty standards are internalized by people, because Ryan says this comes from within you. And we think that's particularly damaging when you believe it reflects your moral character. What do you then do? A few things. First, you're unlikely to do this in a way that is positive to you. You're likely to do things like push through fatigue because you can't let that temple fall into despair. Second, you take extreme risks. If you're just someone who hasn't been able to lose weight, you are much, much more likely to do really dangerous things in order to lose weight, take new experimental drugs, because you worry that your church community or the wider community as a whole will see you as morally deficient, as lacking control, as failing in your duty if you fail to do so. We think this is a narrative that has entrenched the worst aspects of how people treat themselves, and we are very proud to oppose it.
Thanks so much, Emil.
Can everyone hear me if I speak at this volume?
Yep, you can.
Wonderful. Also, if you have to POI me, please yell at me or like wave your hand or something. I won't be checking the chat all that closely. Okay, time will start in 3, 2, 1. A pretty simple extension for you today. First, why other teams in this round are not exclusive, and then why we provide more autonomy and more tolerance. But first, I think Top Half pointed out that there's been a bit of a characterization battle going on. But I think we on Closing Opposition are pretty effectively able to sidestep who says like what and how do they say it. We really care about who is making these sorts of decisions. And why is this? This is because a lot of the things that the other teams in this round talk about are actually not at all exclusive to the narrative of the body as a temple.
soul. So first, a lot of like purity narratives have bases in other things other than like the physical body. So there's still the idea that your soul ought to be pure. Secondly, I think a lot of religious leaders just have a very strong incentive for ideological control, and ideological control often like focuses on like restriction and then like giving something to your members. So you still have purity in that sense. And then finally, purity helps you maintain social order. So like maintaining family purity helps maintain the exact type of family hierarchy that you want to see people within your particular religion hold for various sorts of reasons. Okay. The second thing that isn't exclusive is narratives around like health or bodily maintenance. And I think this like pretty effectively ties into what closing government tells you, because this isn't a this house regrets motion, it's a this house opposes motion. So the propagation of this narrative out to like other aspects of society has already happened. You can oppose this one particular narrative, but I think the harm has already been done. To illustrate the narrative that you are what you eat, I think is quite common. At least I heard it a lot when I was growing up. I think that this narrative is probably even more harmful for people's like physical like sense of self, because kids understand it really well. Like, oh, if you're eating a bunch of chicken, you're going to become a chicken and you're going to be fat and it's terrible. That's a narrative that kids can understand a lot more easily than like the body is a temple, because what even is a temple? What is God? I'm 6 years old. I don't know what that means. So I think that other narratives that are perhaps even more impactful in the negative ways that close to government is pointing out already exist. So you don't have a lot of exclusive impact there. And then there's just other reasons why people prioritize their health and maintenance of their bodies that most people into society buy into. The first, that there's been a lot of scientific research that is like fairly creditable about like how many calories you need to eat per day, what types of nutrients you should get. And then secondly, people just have biological reasons for being healthy. So you have cravings for vegetables or for vitamins or whatever. You also like experience disease and feel terrible if you eat awful food all the time or you never exercise. So there's other reasons why people are healthy, why they care about bodily maintenance. What then is our margin in this debate? I think that we are able to affect the most devoted communities, or people that are otherwise unable to access more autonomy for themselves, for a few reasons. The first thing is that the body is a temple, but specifically the body is a temple that is given to you by God. The soul still belongs to God. That exists on either side of the house, but the house is yours. And I hope that the government provides public insurance for it, as per a few rounds ago. So the soul belongs to God, but the house is uniquely yours. I think that this gives a lot of people a lot more autonomy than they otherwise would have, because the God is like giving you something, God is giving you a gift. This gives you greater capacity to actually use this gift for what you want, as opposed to just the soul, which is meant to be pure, which is meant to be maintained in like the ways that the religious doctrine says. I think that this is also impactful here, because if the house is given to you, you're able to maintain it in the way that you like, and that maintenance puts labor into it. So if you're like exercising or you're eating food and just like making sure that you stay alive, you are doing some sort of labor that is maintaining God's house. And I think that labor is a sort of transaction that lets you take control of your body in a really tangible way that a lot of people are able to feel. I think that especially people that are growing up in religious communities, particularly communities that are extremely devout or a bit more isolated, you don't really have a strong sense of self. You have a very strong communal identity. Your soul belongs to God. You have to follow these certain ways of worshiping, and that strips away a lot of your individual autonomy. So having the ability to get freedom by having this house that is your own, I think frees a lot of people in a lot of important ways. The impact of this is really significant. I think it's able to combat a lot of the ways that religious communities have an incentive to control other people. That is, religious leaders want people to be incredibly devoted to them, so they enforce like purity culture in them in other ways. Or religious leaders have personal gain by like having control of their members' bodies. I think that it creates a lot of opportunities for abuse or manipulation. But when you say that the body is a temple that belongs to the individual, that is something that like even a religious leader can't take away. Whereas they may have like some more influence over your soul, this is a very important aspect that gives people an additional degree of autonomy. And this is like self-ownership is incredibly powerful. It gives people the capacity to leave incredibly restrictive communities, for example. It allows them to explore like the hedonism that opening government wants to talk about. They are otherwise unable to access. Whereas like a majority of people in society are hedonists regardless of this narrative, because this narrative still exists. This accesses a new aspect of the population that is currently unable to engage in these hedonistic activities, and because they have like chosen to live in this religious community. Okay, I'll take that POI from
Yeah,
Oakley.
is it freedom if it's restricting you from doing things that you want to do? Like, I'm kind of unclear on the link between enabling autonomy and a narrative that is restriction of autonomy.
Yeah, so I think that these people currently live in areas that are very restrictive. They live in restrictive societies. But this narrative allows for an additional degree of freedom that they would not otherwise have. So on the counterfactual, like the body isn't a temple, the body just like
wasn't given to you by God. The body just belongs to God, as does your soul. But when your body is something that is given to you as a temple to maintain and to upkeep, that gives you an additional degree of autonomy that you're then able to take control of. And I think that if people do find a lot of satisfaction in religion, you're able to experience a greater degree of devotion when you choose to give your temple back to God and worship in the ways that He wants you to worship. I think that this allows people to access a greater degree of personal autonomy if they choose, but also a greater sense of religious satisfaction. Final point then on why you're better able to tolerate others. I think if the temple is given to you by God, then the temple ought to be respected. And I think that this propagates out against like a lot of other aspects of society that even aren't particularly religious in ways that are really beneficial. So I think that the body is often something that is used to differentiate people in a lot of ways. So like race or height or like physical attributes are often used to discriminate against people. And even if like you believe that souls are sacred, maybe that enables you to abuse bodies that you see as different than yours. But if you believe that every body is given by God as a gift, then that's something that ought be respected. I think that this narrative is incredibly powerful in terms of like fighting against physical and sexual abuse, for example. So you have to respect the temples of other people rather than just their souls. I think it's also beneficial in the treatment of children. Like children kind of have like underdeveloped brains. They're not like fully there. They probably don't have like full souls like real adults do developed to the same extent. But if you respect their bodies to the same extent, I think that you're able to protect against a lot of child abuse and have better child raising practices as well. I think this is also really powerful for things like racism, when people discriminate on the bodies of other people. If those bodies are given to you by God, you ought respect them. I think that religious communities buying into this narrative is particularly valuable because a lot of religious communities like churches are very powerful instruments for socially organizing, creating real meaningful social movements and social change. So what have I brought to you today? I brought to you why you get more tolerance, you get greater autonomy, and why every other team is not exclusive in this round. So proud to oppose.
Thanks so much. Gobweb.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Cool. So what CO wants you to believe the interpretation of the word given in the context of this motion is that God gives you the body and then he kind of runs away and doesn't really think about it. It's just sort of like a gift, you own it, done. That is quite unrealistic, A, because of all the incentive analysis that we've provided on closing government already about why religions and society want to maintain a lot of control, and therefore the belief that God or basically just God cares normatively what you do to this body is quite important. But second of all, just reading the info slide or reading the motion, nothing about the word given implies that it is yours permanently. It is a sacred vessel which takes your soul to the afterlife. So it is temporary necessarily. And there's no implication that that then means that you have automatic autonomy to do whatever, because you have to give it deep respect in both actions and thoughts. I think the comparative in terms of secular morality on our side are a lot of ideas about individualism and freedom. So first, I just want to be clear then about what the key differences are between the sides to avoid the race that's going on OO and CO to try to wash everything except the tiny little impact that they plan to win on. So they argue on opposition that actually no, I'll just do the purification thing here. So I think one, the notion that your body is sacred is a very important and exclusive thing for our side of the house, because I think opening opposition is probably right, that there obviously are secular narratives about beauty standards and so on that exist. But what both OO and CO are messing up here is really failing to see the forest for the trees on just how much this influence has had on determining secular morality. CO makes this very mistake in Member of Op. They say, well, look, there are other narratives that you teach children when it comes to diet. For instance, you are what you eat. I cannot think of a narrative that is more clearly inspired by the idea that your body is a temple, by Christian and Hindu and Buddhist morality about this, than that narrative. Because what it says is that your soul adopts the morality, adopts the character, adopts the laziness or the problems or the unhealthiness of what you consume and you put into it. So the one exclusive factor for our narrative, that the body is a temple, is the connection to morality, the idea that you can degrade your soul or harm your soul in the decisions that you make. And that is not merely about laziness, but rather about a failure to respect something far more fundamental, about a duty or an obligation that you owe. The second attempt at opening opposition then to deal with this is they say that actually believing that you're pure is quite good because it helps to fight back against certain practices that people might want to do to other people, like FGM. First of all, I think it's obvious that the people who are committing FGM are doing it because they believe it purifies the person that they're doing it to, because they believe it makes them more chaste, less likely to think bad thoughts, etc. So I think it clearly comes from a narrative like this. Second, it's not as if you stop this practice, then the alternative cultural practices that would exist would be necessarily better. I don't think very much has been done enough to explain why some other horrifying practice can't be justified. Per their own analysis, beauty standards still exist. Probably in those sorts of society, the beauty standard is that you still ought mutilate people. So I think their own attempt to marginalize our impacts, unfortunately, marginalizes their practical content on this claim as well. So what are the exclusive factors that come out of closing government that make our case work? First is the belief that when your body is a temple, is that it's sacred and it's deserving of respect. That means A, that you need to do things to improve it. You need to be seen to be doing things that morally are believed to respect and honor what you have. And that drives the self-improvement culture. It drives the idea that you can never be static and happy with what you have, because in order to respect something, you must do more. You must get fitter. You must eat more healthily. You must buy a whole range of products and services that are associated with the idea that we can help you achieve this. Because the reality is that, especially in a secular society where we're guided by this morality, but we're like, roughly, in Europe, like 10% of people go to church regularly, is that you don't have someone who's guiding you and telling you you've successfully got a clean temple, right? Or your body's a temple, you're doing a good job. You need to figure it out for yourself. OO suggests that because optimism biases exist, you will just always think that you've got a great and dignified temple. I don't think that's enough given all of the terrible standards that themselves exist, exist in society that want to sell you on the notion that you're not enough. I think more realistically, people are looking for external validation to tell them that they're respecting their body, to tell them that they're doing a good job and that their body is deserving of respect, or that they're respecting their body. And that's where all the content from Sophie about commercialization comes in. You buy products from fitness influencers, you eat certain foods, you go on obsessive diets, you work out too hard, you focus on self-improvement, even when it comes to your personality or to your friend group or so on, and you want to consistently get better, often in a very performative way, because you're trying to perform to yourself the idea that you're respecting your body. There's no gatekeeper or no authority who's necessarily telling you when you've reached that point, and so you need to invent it for yourself. So in that sense, the narrative that your body is a temple is actually very externally performative, because you're looking for validation from others in the form of products or services that they sell to you, so that you can believe yourself that you're honoring your body. The next bit of material from OO, and I think the important push on the comparative, is to argue that in the absence of the belief that every body is a sacred vessel, religions are likely to turn to a comparative where they say that only some people are imbued with this vessel. First, I'm just not sure this is clearly worse than believing that you have not respected your sacred vessel, and I don't think there's very much work to explain the specific difference on why that's worse. But second, I think a religion that says that people are selectively imbued with God just is unlikely to spread and be successful. Primarily on the basis that if you think about which religions have spread and become powerful, they're often religions that proselytize like Christianity and say you can redeem yourself. And that narrative on opposition is like that the narrative that God is only in some of you explicitly pushes the idea that you can't be redeemed because God only exists in some of you. So I think per OO's own concession that it's likely that the narrative should want to push redemption, you probably wouldn't have an alternative narrative like that. OO.
So to be clear, we explained this narrative does work on people who are struggling because people find strength to honor others even if not themselves, and this narrative is communicated in beautiful ways like music, but we also preemptively prevent people from falling into spirals because they don't start self-destructive behavior.
Respectfully, I think any narrative can be communicated beautifully via music. That is not inherent to opposition. I think, second of all, you don't need this narrative to honor other people because you can still think that they're honorable for following their own path, for being autonomous, for being good, for being healthy, etc. Those don't need to be framed through this specific narrative. So that's not particularly exclusive either. What are the clear harms that you're weighing from closing government, and why does that win the round? I think opening opposition went for the very juicy impacts about abortion, end of life, about guilt that were the hardest to prove because they accrued to the actors who were most likely to, in the comparative, have that kind of influence instead. Instead, our strategy on closing government is to talk about the hundreds of millions of people who are exposed to health, fitness, beauty in their everyday, who have to think about self-improvement through the lens of commercialized products that ultimately stem from this religious belief, and who adopt an unproductive attitude as a consequence, who are less likely to think of health or exercise as a process that's just about benefits or enjoyment, but rather a constant process with no end, where they have to purify themselves, where often they're not sure if they're pure at any given point, or where they have to work harder and harder and harder. The profits of this go to the same gatekeepers before, rather than religion, it's corporations, it's influencers, and religion as well, but the harm maintains for a significant number of people. Very proud to propose.
Thanks so much. Ope.
All right, I'll take POIs in chat only. Yes, no need to interrupt. G. Very good. Okay. I'm going to begin by suggesting radically that this debate is very off track, as Max agrees. The problem is that thus far, no team other than CO has made the critical distinction of what the counterfactual narrative looks like. O's case relies on believing that you are somehow special. CG's case relies on religious leaders wanting control. But they never explain why your body in particular is the important aspect here. Because note, in particular against OO, if you believe that it said your soul's important, you still have a reason to go on and live. Maybe you think that God gave you your friends and family, so you have to go on experiencing them. You want to live as long as possible. If you believe that you want God to love you, God can love you because he made your soul, he made you who you were and developed your personality. There's no particular reason why your body is the critical margin. Why is this the likely counterfactual? I just want to point out that the same reasons that Max says, so for example, the idea that you want new recruits, is a reason why you will say that everybody's soul matters. What Ryan says about how you want people to feel like they're comfortable, that they can talk to you, that you're a good person, is also a reason why you tell people that they matter to God. And counterfactually, if you can't say that their body matters, then you say that their soul matters. So why does this take out a lot of O's arguments? Because it means that the stuff about God's love, the stuff about feeling meaningful or having a long life probably exists either way if God gave you this life. Similarly, I think that there's a problem with closing government, which is much along the same lines. They say that you want to be controlled, but it's not clear why you can't just control people in other ways. So religions that don't have this narrative, for example, talk about how you have to memorize prayer, how you have to pray a certain number of times a day, and they oftentimes, as per CG's analysis, make the barrier so high that it's quite difficult for most people to do. So there's still an ability to make people feel guilty and they're not doing enough, even without your body in particular being special. Two, their claim is that you're going to feel extra bad about the way that you look, but this is overdetermined by a bunch of other things. Like we're socialized to care about the way we look because we grew up in ancestral environments where this matters. It affects things like your sexual marketplace value. Facial symmetry is reflective of things like genetic fitness, and so people are going to care about this either way. But moreover, especially in the modern day, things like how you look are reflective of your economic status. So if you're richer, you're expected to, for example, eat healthy, go to the gym, etc., which means that there's symmetrically an incentive to look particularly good. And because of beauty standards, this is going to be very high on either side of the house. But lastly, the claim is that people are going to damage themselves by pushing themselves too hard in dieting. I think that people are most well known for damaging themselves by pushing themselves to look snacks or incels, and they're completely unaffected by this narrative. I don't know that there are that many religious people who are dieting themselves to death. I think that this is particularly uncommon in religious communities, and it's just not a very intuitive characterization. So the result is that it is deeply unclear that closing government or opening opposition
Right.
to that margins. Quickly on opening government then. They say that you're going to have a high degree of restrictiveness. I just want to point out that there are historical reasons why things like having sex with other people are not acceptable. So for example, there's concerns about how that would change paternity, and I'll take PRs in chat only, as I said. And the result of this material is that it is rather likely that there's still going to be a view that having sex with other people is bad for your soul because it's bad emotionally, even if it isn't bad physically. Similarly, I think that, as I'll explain later, the ownership by others, which is the counterfactual, is much worse. I think that the same stuff applies to drugs. The problem with drugs isn't that it affects your body, is that it makes you dependent, and that's why religious communities dislike it. That would still affect your free will, etc. Last thing I want to note is that Max has this weird response to us where he says that you're going to change, historically things develop differently. This is not the UDC manual, sadly. It's the Wittig manual. This is not retrospective. All of the past stuff still exists. So any changes about why you had development of narratives like you are what you eat would still be the same. It's just that those narratives are definitely sufficiently powerful and mimetic that they would exist with or without the existing support from this. What is then the counterfactual that we bring to you, which is critical in the round? I want to explain to you that the counterfactual is a view that not that you own yourself or that God owns you, but that others own you in a very deep way. Why is this likely? For three reasons. One, I think that Gov explains to you that there's an incentive for religious leaders to exercise control over you. And if they can claim that they are the ones who own your bodies because you're like a member of their congregation or something, then that's going to be very powerful. Similarly with kings, royals, etc. Two, I think there's just historical groups that have secondary status. And Eves points out, women, for example, are in some places seem to be historically owned by their husbands, not by God. And similarly, children are seen to be owned by their parents. But three, I think that Gov is right that sometimes you want to maximize control. How is this worse? This is worse in two ways. One, you are unable to rebel against the system because there's no way for you to know what the limitations are. You are at the whim of others, which is to say that there's no like written rules about what your priest can and cannot do, which means you have very little desire to push back against things like systemic abuse. On our side of the house, you have more control. They are able to do things like control how you look. Sorry, on Gov's side of the house, they could control how you look. They could do things like force you to enact certain roles, etc. The stuff about soul is not symmetric here because your soul is about your divine status. But the point is that religious people now have the right to control the way you act on Earth, which is far more powerful and far worse. I'm going to explain why the comparative is far better, but before that, OG.
Yeah, this narrative is so harmful because it creates sins that are easily identifiable and then normalizes other people intervening in the way you use your body to prevent those sins. This narrative is what triggers the ownership by others.
Yeah, so the problem is that things like missing prayers are sins in other religions. They're also quite easily identifiable. There are lots of other things that you could do are identifiable. So for example, having sex outside of marriage isn't a sin against your body. It's a sin against the right of marriage, which God says is something that's uniquely important because it is the union of a man and a woman. So again, this is like completely symmetric. Okay, what is the change that we're going to have? The first thing is I want to frame that I think the most important margin in this debate is in relatively or very religious communities. So it's like on the more religious side of the spectrum for three reasons. First of all, this takes Gov at their best. So Gov says that these are the places where the abuse happens the most. So if we prove that there's a margin there, we easily flip them. And second of all, I think that there are three additional reasons. So one, people must believe in God in a somewhat strong sense in order for the way that God views to change their life. There are lots of people who are like nominally religious but don't act that differently because of God. But two, I just want to point out that these groups are highly numerous. So in many cases, for example, across the US, you have groups like this. So if we can prove a margin that in highly religious and restrictive communities, you get slightly more freedom, we're able to win the round. What is then the change that we identify on our side of the house? Max is right. God doesn't just give you the body. God has an existing contract with you about what your body is. But this is good for a few reasons. One, I think that there's an understanding of what this contract looks like. So for example, you can look at the Bible and understand what God desires of you. God doesn't desire arbitrary things the same way a priest might desire of you. And now you have some ability to fact check this. But moreover, I think that you have this baseline view that God loves you. So the person who owns your body wouldn't want you to do bad things to yourself or do bad things to others or do things that make you uncomfortable, whereas your priest might. So you have some default level of autonomy there. I think that even if this isn't the default way that people interpret this, the fact that when people feel that they're in conflict with their community, they look for justification in sacred texts and they're able to find this justification, which is highly plausible, gives them this internal feeling and far more ability to actualize themselves. How does this affect people in three ways? One, people are able to leave religious communities when they feel bad because they think that religious communities exercising too much control. They could point out and reform into religious communities. So like if my priest is really abusive, I could say that he's not respecting the fact that my body is sacred. And three, I think that it avoids at least internal self-hatred. So even if I feel like there's something that my priest is requiring of me that's irrational, I'm not likely to hate myself. I'm likely to realize that God wouldn't want my body to be used in this way. Three reasons why this is the most important margin in the debate. First of all, these people are the most effective if they're in very religious communities. But two, people are able to opt into this narrative. All of the other cases about narratives that are enforced on you, when you opt into a narrative, you can believe it fully with all of your soul, so the effect of that narrative is far stronger on you. But third of all, we explain that there are all of these oppressive forces that are symmetric, but the fact that there's anything that can counteract it, that you can latch onto, is extremely powerful for you to feel like you have autonomy, so proud to oppose.
Thanks all for a really fun round.